Hello, I'm Carla Arellano, a partner in McKinsey's People and Organization practice. And for several years, I've led our capabilities in the space of people and org analytics. I'm excited to spend some time with you today, sharing thoughts on how you as leaders can advance diversity and inclusion in your organizations and contribute to build a more inclusive and productive economy more broadly, in particular, leveraging the advances in data availability and AI. We'll start with the case for action. Not surprisingly, COVID-19 is expected to accelerate recent trends around virtual interactions, digitization, and automation, impacting both how we work and the work that is available. Three things for us to keep in mind about how these trends are impacting work. The first is the scale of the impact. We're finding that post-pandemic, about 25% more jobs are going to be impacted than pre-pandemic across the 8 largest economies. Second, the types of jobs that are going to be impacted is pretty significant. In particular, we're seeing that jobs that require physical proximity, so customer service jobs, food service, etc., those are the jobs that are experiencing the most digitization and automation and are more likely to be impacted. As part of that, a key here is the individuals who have those jobs tend to be women, Hispanics, Black Americans, and entry-level workers. That means that that whole segment of society is more likely to be impacted by these trends. And then the final point for us to keep in mind here is that as those jobs that go away, the jobs that become available and the jobs that are experiencing growth actually require a very different level of skills and capabilities than previously. So actually making that switch and the transition from a customer service job to a job that requires digital literacy or working with computers, etc., is going to be a significantly larger transition than before. And therefore, the requirement on us as leaders and as talent leaders to support those transitions proactively is going to be increasingly important. Now, I tend to be a bit of a glass half full person, and I think that at least the benefit that we have today as leaders is that advances in data availability and advanced analytics and AI are actually potentially really good friends to us as we think about how we can support workers in making these transitions and how we can support employees and society at large in enabling these transitions. So let's start by talking about some of the trends that COVID-19 has accelerated. There's 3 trends that we see COVID-19 has accelerated that are likely to persist to some degree post the pandemic. The first is remote work, virtual meetings, and travel. We've all seen that work from home is likely to persist post the pandemic. It might go down versus sort of during the pandemic, but most employees have quoted that they would like to retain some element of virtual or hybrid work in their day-to-day work post the pandemic, and many employers are making moves to support that. While business travel is likely to pick back up again, it is unlikely to pick back up again to the same degree as it was in before the pandemic, and we're estimating that about 20% of business travel is expected to be about 20% lower in 2030 than it was pre the pandemic. Leisure travel is a bit of a TBD. Our sense is that people will, especially as the pandemic lightens up, people will resume leisure travel to a certain degree, but probably over time, not to the same degree as pre-pandemic. The second big trend is around e-commerce and virtual transactions. I think we have all experienced the joy of being able to order more online. Well, depending on who you are, maybe not as much of a joy, but really e-commerce and the convenience that it brings, both in terms of delivery, the notion of restaurant delivery, online groceries, etc., has been on the rise during the pandemic. And as many consumers settle into new habits around that, our expectation is that those trends are likely to continue as consumer behavior is cemented around the use of digital services. And then finally, automation and AI. While automation adoption has slowed a bit during the pandemic, as organizations continue to look for ways to create sort of more separation or de-intensify their work environments, as they look for ways to drive productivity, etc., we expect automation and AI to continue growing. What does this mean? It means that more workers are going to need to switch jobs as the jobs available change, and that the impact is likely to be greater on women, Hispanics, Black Americans, and entry-level workers. Let's talk a little bit more about what that looks like. So we've talked about COVID-19 accelerating trends that are changing the jobs that are available. If you see this chart in front of me, on the left-hand side, that blue bar, that shows jobs that are growing, so occupations that are growing. And we do see some growth, right? We're seeing growth in roles around health, technicians, care workers, health professionals, STEM professionals. And a lot of that growth is growing above where we had expected the growth to be pre-COVID. That's that little orange dot. If we look at the other side of the page, the black charts though, those are the jobs that are actually going to start declining. And several of them are declining even more than we had expected them to decline pre-COVID, so pre the pandemic. So you'll see in particular office support, customer services, and sales, those towards the bottom. Food services as well, that second row, all of those are going to decline further than we had expected them to pre-pandemic. And in particular, food services and customer service and sales are going to go down by 1 million and 3.2 million jobs themselves. So those are pretty big reductions. And what we tend to see is that in those sectors, those individuals are going to need to start looking at new job opportunities. What that amounts to is that about 25% more workers than before the pandemic are likely going to need to switch occupations. In the US, that's about 17 million workers, and you can see the bottom of the chart what that looks like across some of the larger economies. I think that the big thing here that we see is that this is a larger increase than we had seen pre the pandemic. So it's the scale of the impact is significantly larger than we had expected pre the pandemic. The second important thing to notice here as we think about this change in job occupation is the types of skills that are going to be required on a go-forward basis. So one of the things that we see is those jobs that are likely going to go away and the occupations that are going to go away tend to be jobs that require what we call, or tend to be jobs that are in the lowest wage quintiles and jobs that require physical and or manual labor. If you see the chart here, we can see that physical and manual skills are in heavy demand in that fifth wage quintile, so the sort of the end of the part of the workforce that receives the lowest wages. When we look at that part of the economy, we see that those workers pre the pandemic could have expected to move to sort of the next level up, so an easier transition in terms of occupation. But what we're seeing post COVID-19 is that a larger proportion of these workers are going to need to transition out of that fifth and fourth category of wage quintile and move into that third and second quintile, which is where the jobs are going to be, and those are jobs that require very different skill levels. If you look at the shift, that gray starts to go down from about 50% in the fifth quintile to 36 and then 12% in the third and second quintiles. So what we find there is that about over half of the folks in the fifth and fourth quintiles who are going to need to switch jobs are going to need to move up a wage quintile. That means that they are going to need to learn a whole new set of skills. Pre the pandemic, we had thought that that would be about 6% needing to move up. So going from about 60% to 50% is a really big jump. And it's a really big demand as you think about workers in those categories being upskilled or reskilled into new areas, not just learning those skills, but also thinking through how they engage and how they approach finding a job in relatively, net new territory. Alongside that, it's not just the fact that it's lower wage quintiles that are impacted and folks who traditionally have less access to education and other job support and advancement resources. It's also that those jobs tend to disproportionately be the roles that vulnerable populations have. So women are more likely to be impacted. Workers without college degrees are more likely to be impacted. Younger workers, and then Hispanics and African Americans. In particular, if you remember that chart where we saw sort of food services being impacted, Hispanics and women are overrepresented in food services. When we think about physical and manual labor as well, those tend to be areas where young workers start, or where immigrants start engaging, and that's sort of how they get into the workforce. And the other area that we see impacted, if you remember a few slides back, when we looked at customer service and sales and the 3.2 million jobs impacted there, those tend to be areas that entry-level workers start in. So as those jobs go away, the bar, sort of the steepness of the curve for somebody entering the workforce is going to be that much steeper, right? Not going in, let's say, to be a customer service representative, but needing to go in a different area, more at a manager level. So the need for those folks who are impacted to really get access to education, to career support, for education to start changing earlier on is going to be increasingly important. So when we look at all of this, it's daunting already, right, to sort of look at these facts and figures and see sort of the change that is coming to the workforce and the skills required in the populations impacted. I'm going to add in one more lens, which is even scarier in my mind, and this is the impact on women in particular beyond what we have been looking at. So pre-COVID, while it might not have felt the same to everybody, women had been making some progress in the workforce. If you see here this chart in front of you, what you'll see is that blue bar. Basically, it takes us from entry-level workers in that column A all the way to column F, the C-suite. And you'll see that from 2015 to 2020, there's been actual growth in not just in women representation in entry-level roles, but also in that column E, senior vice presidents, and in the C-suite, where we've actually seen growth from 17% representation in 2015 in the C-suite to 21% representation in the C-suite. So we've started to see some real gains. Similarly, pre-COVID, we had seen that women were not opting out of the workforce to a greater degree than men. So when we looked at attrition across organizations from 2015 to 2020, we had found that women and men, the attrition levels were very similar. So it wasn't that women were opting out more than men. Now, what we're seeing is that COVID may actually reverse this momentum as well. So not just in terms of jobs that are available and what the job makeup looks like, but also in terms of women's willingness and ability to stay in the workforce. Studies looking at women in COVID are finding that 1 in 4 women are considering leaving the workforce or downshifting their career. In particular, this is happening with women who have children under the age of 10 and women who are parents overall. And we see that is impacting women more than men, as you see the blue chart here relative to the black chart. When we look at potential drivers, we're seeing that a lot of this is, well, part of it is driven by the feeling of being more exhausted, more burned out, the sort of burden that women have taken on during COVID. If you see this chart here, it's one of those fun ones to look at, but those little dots basically show the proportion of fathers or mothers, senior level men, senior level women, etc., who feel excluded, pressured to work more, burned out, or exhausted. And you'll see that across the board, the female side of the equation is consistently higher, especially when you think about exhaustion and burnout. So what this means is that in addition to what we're seeing in terms of what is happening to the workforce and the types of jobs that are being available, and that disproportionately impacting women and ethnic minorities and others, We are also seeing that women who are in the workforce are being impacted and might be, ready to leave or downshift their job. So it's sort of like we're getting a double whammy as we think about the impact of COVID on diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workforce and in society at large. So what does this mean for companies and for each of us as leaders and leaders in the space of talent? I'm going to take us a step back for a minute, not because I think we all need the reminder, but because, I always find it helpful to anchor myself again on, so why does this matter as I think about what actions to take and what to do about it? We all talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion mattering, and of course it's, good in and of its own right. We also know, though, that it is, good business and good for the economy and good for every organization. And here are some of my favorite statistics. I'll just talk to a couple of them. So we all know that on the diversity side, we've started to see that ethnically diverse companies do outperform those that are less diverse. And here we see the stat of about they're 36% more likely to outperform less diverse organizations. What we're also starting to see here, which I think is interesting here, is that equity and inclusion matter as well. And in particular, those are areas where employees and individuals' talent starts to vote with their feet. So we see that employees who perceive that their organization offers both opportunities and fairness are 3 times more likely to stay and 3 times more likely to recommend their organization. Similarly, we see that employees are 40% more likely to stay with their company if they perceive it to be inclusive, if you see in that side. So it's not just, the overall performance of the organization. It also comes down to every organization's ability to not just attract, but also retain talent, and talent that not just diverse talent, but talent in general. So it's a big reminder to all of us that, taking action matters. So what actions can we take? I think that the first thing that I want to highlight here is that we now have so many different tools at our disposal as leaders with the advent of data and transparency into not just where somebody went to school, but the types of skills that they have, the experiences they have, understanding of what job transitions have worked across different sectors, etc. The transparency that we get from access to data and AI has really broadened our toolkit as leaders in terms of what actions we can take. So first, really thinking about how do you make talent a strategic advantage. And here I always start by counseling folks to say the first thing you need to do is to translate your strategy and your strategic priorities into very specific skill and experience needs with 3, 5, and 10-year horizons. It's really about shifting from viewing talent and your talent needs as sort of a headcount plan and as numbers in your financial spreadsheet to really thinking about talent as what skills and capabilities do we need, when are we going to need them, what depth and breadth, and how do we start planning proactively to get them now. So that's the first piece. Second is really investing in the skills that you need. So once you know what are the skills, the capabilities, and the experiences that we're going to need, which are the ones that might be in less demand given what we're trying to do as an organization, how do we start, looking at how to fill those gaps and or needs that we have, and being really proactive in terms of understanding what skills your organization has today. What is it that your folks can do? Not just what job title they have or how long they've been with the company, but what skills do they have? And importantly, each of those skills, how does it relate to the skills that you need? Folks who know statistics, how close is that to maybe some of your needs around data science and R or Python? Areas where you have folks with strong customer service experience, how does that translate into other areas that you need to work with customers? And or the area of sales, really thinking through how do you take a broad lens and pretty granular view of the skills that you have in your organization and the skills that you're going to need, and start to map out where you need to invest in reskilling and or diversifying how and where you hire to be able to focus on the skills that you need and getting those in the door. Really thinking through how do you cultivate a diverse and inclusive culture so that as you bring folks in or as you grow folks, they stay with you. And then really thinking holistically about the talent ecosystem, making sure that you are partnering with others to create this movement as a community. No organization is an entity unto itself. So getting a little bit deeper, the skills that we need. While every organization is unique in terms of the skills that it will need, we're starting to see across the board some shifts, right, that you can start thinking about as you build out, your talent playbook. We've talked quite a bit about technical skills, and that tends to be one of the first things that folks think about. In addition to sort of the more advanced technical skills, there's just a rise in digital literacy as well that every organization needs to be thinking about. The other big skill area is social emotional skills. So interpersonal skills, empathy, adaptability, leadership. Those skills are going to be in higher demand. And I think the good news there is that a lot of that comes down to not necessarily, technical training, a lot more about apprenticeship, management, and coaching in terms of building those skills. The other thing that we see is that the more basic cognitive skills are going to sort of go down. Not necessarily that they're not needed. It's just that in and of themselves alone, they won't get you there. They're going to need to be paired either with those higher cognitive skills, so creativity, critical thinking, judgment, and or with social emotional skills as well, in order to get you the workforce that you need. I was mentioning earlier this notion of really understanding the skills that you have. We find it really important to create transparency into the skills and experiences that exist within your organization and look for those domino paths to inform upskilling and reskilling. So what are those jobs or occupations that you have that have very close similarities to others, where you can actually look for paths for your folks as they continue to progress within the organization? The example that you see here, there's a lot of blue on the chart, but what this does is it's basically a skill adjacency view. It takes a whole bunch of jobs on the left-hand side, which are roles that were sort of in high demand going into COVID. Small business bankers, customer service representatives, account collectors, etc. And saying how close are those jobs, how much skill adjacency is there between those jobs and branch-based roles, really, so that banks could really think through, well, if I can't have folks physically in the branch, where else could I deploy them? What are other opportunities for these people and the skills that they have? And what do I need to do to start closing any gaps that they might have? And this is what I say, sort of taking that view of the skills that you have and the skills that you need, and then looking for where you have adjacencies and thinking about that domino path. Because doing that proactively means that you can start upskilling and reskilling your folks early on, as well as thinking more broadly about your talent pool. Right? It's less about, do I need job X or job Y tomorrow, but, what will I need 2 or 3 years from now, and how can we get on that journey? Once you have that skill adjacency view, you can start looking at, well, what are the specific skills that we need to close those gaps? And what you see here is a very granular view that takes a specific skill across 2 different jobs, in this case, a mortgage loan officer and a branch manager, and says, well, what's the depth of that skill in each one of the roles? And then what are the specific activities or skills that we would need to teach somebody to help them close that gap? So taking that granular view and looking at skill adjacencies and starting to make the sort of map out the path, that learning journey that you need to bring somebody on, is what starts to help you close that gap and take action. Taking that skill adjacency view and a skill-based view internally matters. It also matters when you think about hiring. So part of this game is obviously going to be around what you do with the folks that you have today across different jobs that might be growing or declining in demand, and how you can help the folks that you have today get there. The second part of the equation, though, is thinking through in the areas where you don't have folks, how do you think differently about hiring? And how do you hire really with a skills-based view and a view towards potential and the ability for somebody to learn, as opposed to sort of our typical approach to hiring, which tends to be based on degrees and or years of experience. What you see here is what it might look like, what your candidate pool starts to look like when you take a skills-based view to the talent pool. So saying it's not just about a particular skill, but the skills that are adjacent. If you look at something like cloud computing, you see that there's sort of a 4x increase in the availability of candidates, and specifically female candidates, when you look at skills that are adjacent to cloud computing, where if you were to invest a little in some of the talent you bring on board, you broadly increase your talent pool and your ability to bring in the best talent there is. So thinking about not just the talents that you have and how you reskill and upskill them, but also as you look at to hire, how do you take more of a skill-based view to hiring so you create a broader set of opportunities and start to explore that broad part of the population that is increasingly going to need help and need that step into new occupations and new skills, and might have many of the skills that you need. They just need that small help to sort of close the gap to make that transition. This is a view of, as you think about supporting your employees as they think about what their transition and growth might look like, whether it's within your organization or more broadly. Again, how do you use data and AI to start to create that view? The beauty of some of what we're seeing is that it's not just about transitions that folks have made in your organization, right? I have many of my clients ask, well, if I have folks, who've started in part A of the organization, where do they typically transition? How can I think about career paths for them? Increasingly, we're finding that data and AI can show us career paths broadly across different companies and industries. So while a certain skill set may or may not be, the right skill set for your organization, there might be a pathway for that individual and their skills in a different organization, in a different industry. And what they need is some transparency into what that learning journey might look like and where they might go next. So that's been quite a bit for you. There's a few questions as you think about sort of where you're going and how you invest. I'm really going to focus on number 2 and 3, which has been most of the conversation. How are you leveraging data and technology to ensure that you're securing the talent that you need, but then also advancing diversity and inclusion? And again, how do you use that to address skill gaps, both within your organization and then as you think about bringing a broader population set on board? And then I thought I'd leave you with a little bit of an imperative. And what you see here is the difference between acting now and waiting to act. So what you see on the top half of the chart is GDP impact in 2030 if we start making moves towards gender parity. And that first column is the do nothing scenario. If we don't do anything to address the impact that COVID has had, this one is specifically focused on gender parity in occupations, but if we don't take action now, we're going to see a 1 trillion decline in GDP in 2030 due to COVID-19. If we wait to take action, so if we say, I get it, it matters, but not yet, we have other things going on, we're going to start to take action in 2025, we'll see an 8 trillion positive impact. But if we take action now, we could actually add $13 trillion to our global GDP in 2030. So it's not just about not taking action, it's about taking action now. And there are so many tools at your disposal. So I really invite you to step back and think about how do you rethink talent and rethink your approach to diversity, inclusion, and equity using data and analytics and reshaping your talent strategies with them. Thank you again for the time. I very much appreciate it, and I look forward to hopefully connecting in the real world at some point in the future. Bye.